right. Welcome to Beyond the Board. I am Alaa. Today I'm joined with Arinze Okafor, CEO and founder of Namibia Investment and Finance Academy, NIFA. Arinze is a chartered financial analyst with a deep experience across Namibia's financial sector. He also lectures at the Namibian Business School. At NIFA, his and team partners with institutions like Standard Bank Namibia to deliver small and medium-sized businesses programs that blends practical training with global certifications from Bloomberg and Harvard. Arinze, welcome.
Thank you, Alaa.
It's a pleasure having you, and I'm excited about our conversation and looking forward to learning more about what you've been achieving in Namibia. What problem first pulled you into founding NIFA Academy?
Okay, no, thank you for that. Good afternoon. I think we're about 1 hour apart.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, no, great question. So I want to just take one step back. So I think really, obviously my background has been from a traditional sort of finance perspective. So I started my career as an intern at the central bank. And that was just after coming back from my studies in the UK. So then, something you realize quite quickly is, I think one of my first tasks, I had to assess one of the local banks' banking license application. And now you come fresh from UK, great university, but then you realize on the job, it requires, practical skills. So you will not always learn everything in university. So as much as, it's not to say all of these global universities are not good, but there's a big gap between theory and practice. Having been an intern and then moving up the ranks in the central bank, in 2020 is when I had this passion for skills and capacity building. So throughout my time at the bank, I used to look after the interns. In 2020, I put my idea to paper. I used to lecture part-time at one of the universities. I used to teach MBA students on investments, portfolio management. And in class, they used to tease me that I had a PowerPoint, but I never looked at it. I used to teach most of them directly from my portfolio and then give practical examples in terms of what I do in the office. All of this cemented the need for me to create and advise my academy. I realized there is a gap between theory and practice. And that's essentially what led to the formation of Namibia Investment and Finance Academy. So it really then started out focusing on internships and graduates, but also in my other background, I'm quite entrepreneurial. And many may see me as a corporate, but, I'm quite active in entrepreneurship, with a few, small businesses. And the challenges even I face, it's not easy to access capital. NIFA has been personally funded. And you start to realize the challenges that even SMEs face. And that's why you see then NIFA also then sort of diversified to offer practical SME targeted capacity building. So that's really the crux of what NIFA does.
That's very interesting, Arinze. From what you're saying, you were able to continuously identify this gap, and this gap got bigger and bigger the longer throughout the journey, basically. And what's interesting was about you. Maybe yes, academic, as you mentioned, obviously it's important, but it's missing that piece that you are now filling, which is the more practical piece about understanding finance better. And then you've also touched on the reason you've understood the gap even more was because you've gone as a business starting NIFA, you've gone through a bit of challenge as well. So that gives you an understanding of small businesses and what they're going through and how you can help them.
No, absolutely.
How long has NIFA been helping small and medium sized businesses in Namibia?
Yeah, so I would say a little over a year, almost 2 years. You know the saying about when you work alone, you go faster, but then when you collaborate, you really go further. So I
That's right.
think the takeoff for 2024, where we first had a practical session on equity valuation, right? And why this is relevant is this particular course is typically taught only in South Africa. But given my time and from my asset management background, when I left the central bank, I used to manage an institutional fixed income portfolio. And then I transitioned into, sort of an equity type mandate. And this particular course is only done in SA. So then I always had this passion to say, okay, how do we localize that in Namibia? So early 2024, we hosted one of the first equity valuation workshops. And it was almost fully subscribed, about 80%. People appreciated it. It was a 5-day workshop. And they left there from day one, understanding how to practically use Excel to come up with a valuation or a buy or sell decision at the end of day 5. And the way we structured it was I'd invited a few of my peers in the industry. We formed part of the panel on the last day. So it almost replicated what you would do as an analyst, where you present a buy or sell decision to your committee or your board. So I really think the academy started to take off. Hosted a few AI workshops and in between practical interventions for SMEs. And then this year, we partnered with MTC, which is a listed company here in Namibia, and we brought Bloomberg to Namibia. And we found out at the time, it's actually Africa's first Bloomberg Finance Lab. So if you look at the sequence, that was now in March. We started integrating Bloomberg, which has financial literacy certification, and look at the challenges with SMEs. We receive funding, but sometimes we don't know what vehicles to put some of our savings. So we also then actively started engaging SMEs. And then that unlocked a partnership with Standard Bank and also recently with GIZ, it's a German developmental agency, where I'm happy to share, Alaa, that I think in the next week, I'm going to be going through all of the regions here in Namibia, capacitating over 300 MSMEs. But I think the most exciting one is we have to also capacitate financial service providers. Now imagine how fun that is, where you present to FSPs the reality of MSMEs on the ground, which will then help them come up with, targeted product configurations that actually match, the cash flow cycles of SMEs. So why I thought it was important to paint this picture is to show you that it's been a calculated and disciplined journey to get where we are now, through failing forward and being an SME myself, understanding exactly what an SME requires. And I'd like to emphasize and say, Alaa, my focus is, or NIFA particularly, we don't really focus on your typical startups, right? So startups are good, but I think my focus is different. We're not, it would be great to find a unicorn, but we're really focused on small growing businesses, whether informal or rural. And
Operating.
already operating. I like the background of where you're having this.
Thanks.
The point is, you could be a consultant, you're trading in your house, but 6 months to 1 year, you already have proof of cash flow, proof of concept, right? Sometimes you might be getting clients in your personal business account, but that's the limitation to you getting bank funding. So it's really targeted. It's saying move from your personal to a business account. Let a funder just see that you are making cash flow. You already stand a better chance to getting funding. You could be, like in a city market, maybe street food. So that person, if it's an informal vendor, she's already trading. How do you support her? She could have the same problem, trading from her individual account, trading for survival, but how do you help her? She maybe has 1 or 2 employees, so she's already creating jobs. How do you help her? The best help you can do is formalize her buy, maybe providing her access to, one of the SME who's providing meat, and now she starts to get consistent supply. What can then happen? She starts to grow, right? It could also be as simple as you are opening a car wash. You have already 10 clients. What happens? Now you scale. Now you want to have a small restaurant. That business becomes a second business stream. Now that restaurant also requires someone to supply you food, right? someone to supply you dishwashing liquid to wash the cars. So it's that whole value chain across the small but growing businesses. And that is really the ultimate target market of NIFA, because we want to bridge that gap. Coming back to Namibia and the African continent, I saw 2 days ago, Alaa, it's between 1% to 2% of venture capital flows that actually come to the African continent. And it goes only into a few countries and a few startups.
Say the number again, Arinze? 1 to
Between
2%.
between 1 to 2, less than 2%. Now imagine that. But then you look across Africa, you're going to see a lot of businesses classified as informal. But that sector is actually the one that also creates most of the jobs. And that's the very interesting phenomenon that is not only a Namibian story, but I have a strong belief from some of the things I've read, it's an African story. So that
Yes.
really in a nutshell has then sort of given you a track record of some of the work we've done, some of the strategic partners that have bought into our story.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and you've explained it to me now. If you could take us through a small business journey, getting the support from NIFA, how would that take place? In that process you've explained, where would you guys come in? At which part of the journey of that business?
Thank you for asking. So any business journey, if you look at it, really centers on 3 parts, right? It's capacity building, access to capital, and then ultimately access to market, right?
That's right.
So we come in at the beginning and we focus a lot on, you hear this saying, oh, back the jockey, right? We focus on the founder. So it's really at the beginning. And linked to NIFA's work is we have a very market-leading psychometric software. And so it typically, like psychometrics, you think you're applying for a job interview and it's usually applied at the end, right? But in one of our programs backed by Standard Bank Namibia, all of the participants, we did psychometrics on each of them. So recently we announced about 40 successful MSMEs. What's interesting, Alaa, to share is that we can do a SWOT analysis on you. The same way, if I'm a founder, if I'm a visionary, you will see that my strength will show on the psychometrics, it's creativity and the likes. But what you quickly realize is that founders sometimes have significant gaps, which is attention to detail, organization, and so forth. Those factors affect the business. So what do you do?
Right.
Should you discount that founder because he has those gaps? No. But how does it help me as an entrepreneur or a business owner? Maybe I need to hire a co-founder, or my next hire is someone who can plug that gap. And that is a strategic way of looking at investing, especially when you're backing the founder. That is effectively the type of insights and methodology in doing capacity building. If I know your gaps are administrative, I won't be surprised that I see bookkeeping and governance as a challenge. So if I'm providing capacity building, it's targeted. The training would be focused specifically on getting you someone who explains how a bookkeeping should be done, so that your books are in order, which will ultimately help you present your case to a funder. Sometimes you get these geniuses, right? But they can't speak like you and I. They can't articulate their business idea, but they have all of the characteristics. They're resilient, gritty, right? How do you help that person? He needs to hire one of the best comms person, right? That he sits next to and articulates his idea. So you see, it's not rocket science, but it is really a different way of doing things. So then, on the access to capital, I think capital is broad, right? The most obvious place most of the time is banks. But it's not that banks don't want to lend to that market. The requirements are quite, so then how do you help such people? You have to be a vehicle that can, sort of channel grants. And I want to qualify what grants means, because in my view, grants are disappearing. Catalytic funding. Cheap capital that allows you to de-risk that business that ultimately makes him investment ready for your banks, for your VCs, or impact funders. So
So you're
that's where
talking about grants, not loans.
grants.
Yeah.
But I like to say strategic CSR, grants that are sort of cheap capital. And it actually sits in between a grant and a cheap loan, because
Mm.
that cost of capital provides that business the breathing room to stabilize. And then you provide pipeline for your banks and your other financiers. And I like the question you asked because, there is a lot of global grants, right? But sometimes, and if you ask yourself, has it been targeted to this segment of our market? Not just Namibia, in Africa in general. So
Yeah.
imagine if that type of capital comes in a targeted manner that provides skills capacity building, cheap funding, that then allows that guy or lady to scale from 2 to 10 customers. What have you now provided? You've de-risked. Then the bank can look at you. A small SME intermediary can look at you. What does that then bring? It then allows you to get funded and ultimately leads to the market. So that is really where NIFA plays. One of our sister entities is, so I've actually founded an impact fund. And that is really the vehicle. So it's not yet active, but that's the vehicle that I'm envisioning to mobilize some of this capital so that it funds the quality pipeline that NIFA is then creating. Because you need to be focused. I really want to play in the space of, the capacity. Bring them up to a level where it feeds the other ecosystem players. So that really, in a nutshell, I hope to answer your question in a long-winded way, where NIFA plays.
You've answered it really well, and I'm so impressed by what you've achieved there. If I'm honest, it's a business model or capacity building in terms of business that I don't think a lot of people are thinking about it the way you're thinking about it. Just a question on this journey here. So you tailoring, you've engaging with the founder, you're tailoring the gap that they need according to their needs, and then you're also helping them to identify what kind of funding they need and where they can get that funding from. Is that right to say?
Yeah, but even a step further, and that was key to having Standard Bank as a partner, is part of the training is directly to say, how do you prepare a successful loan application? What do you need to have in place to get an overdraft or working capital? Because a lot of us, you have these personal income assets, expense or asset liability sheet the banks give you. Some don't know how to fill it. But if you're sort of mentored and coached, then you start to do that on a monthly basis. You start to be prepared. So then you have sort of ingrained it to how to prepare to access funding. So sorry to cut you, but that's
No, that's what I wanted to know. So then NIFA has relationships. Is that right to assume that NIFA has relationships with lenders and fintech leaders or any loan provider, let's say banks or financial services that could help those individuals who participate in their programs?
yeah. So really to answer that in a simple ways, and that's why I introduced myself with my background. So having been in central banking, I've been in asset management, which I still currently am. So I manage, a listed portfolio, shares, government bonds, but I was also a co-founder on one or two entities that deal with SME specific financing. So in my personal capacity and maybe leveraging a bit of social capital, so we've got quite a deep network across the funding ecosystem. So then what do you do as the jockey or the founder? I've put all of that network into NIFA, and that links and connects the ecosystem. From academia, you're partnered with a leading university here in Namibia, then you start to collaborate with your telcos, your banks, and so forth. Everything, or one thing that ties all of them, or two things that ties all of them together is financial literacy and capacity building. And that's what the academy is. So then we position ourselves, and even though we're a private sector player, but we really sit in the middle of connecting public and private, also given my previous background. So we want to really be an ecosystem enabler and connector. So that's really what then links me into relationships with banks because I understand their product configuration, the impact investing side and blended finance. And that's where your grants, that's why I'm saying this new phase we're moving into in Africa, I don't think it's grants, it's catalytic support, technical assistance, because that type of funding is valuable in providing the capacity building because a bank has commercial capital. It can't necessarily give you the money to formalize yourself. But when you use grants in a targeted manner, it completely opens up pipeline to all of the various funding intermediaries across the various capital sort of mechanisms.
Of
So
course, of course.
that's really where it's at.
NIFA is only operating right now in Namibia.
Yes.
Okay, so let's, in terms of knowledge gap, right? And then we zoom out. Why do you think capability building for SMEs mission critical for Africa's growth now?
And let me expand that answer further, Alaa. So you see, NIFA, I call it a double barrel approach. We also train graduates or interns. And our philosophy is both sides capacitate you with the relevant skills, the mindset, and the resilience, so that ultimately you either end up in a job or you become an employer. So moving from that, when you look at the African continent, for example, here in Namibia, 70% of the population is 35 and below. The African continent is quite youthful. Now, look at Europe and the rest of the world. They're an aging society, right?
Yes, that's
Now,
right.
what's the biggest gap between Africa and the rest of the world? It's investment in skills. Education is one thing, but practical skills like life-based skills is another. And that we must admit, that's probably one of the biggest differences between the African continent and developed nations, the skill factor. So we can talk about the disproportionality of capital allocation, but to really answer your question, I think people is your biggest in asset class. And when you look at the African continent, we have a lot of potential. If you link that into what we're discussing today in terms of entrepreneurship, who does that rest on? The jockeys, the people. So you have bankers are educated, you have degrees, but the practical experience to understand when not to quit as an SME because it gets tough. Some of those are life skills that you're not going to learn in a university. So the investment in skill, once you can teach the person resilience and a growth mindset, you will succeed in your career or in your business. For me, I think the next shift, especially from an African perspective, is investment in targeted capacity building. So NIFA's goal is, although I'm really, focused here on Namibia because obviously from here, and I always believe in solve first problems at home because that's what a patriot should do. But ultimately, the same challenges we have here in South Africa, you might have it in Ghana and elsewhere. And that's why I think from an African content perspective, and if I'm an impact investor, I would really look at vehicles that emphasize, firstly, investment in skills, the founders, and you then link it to access to the right capital, because ultimately, the role of government or public sector, they are really the ones that support access to market via policy and so forth. But as private sector,
This is amazing. And you're really hitting the nail there. I had a conversation with a fintech leader last week where they helped small businesses with loans because they after they might be, the criteria is easier than the bank, obviously, right?
yes,
And I asked the question about the literacy gap. I was like, when those companies come to you with applications and they want to get loan, do you see that there is a gap when it comes to financial literacy? Do they fully understand their business? Do they fully understand their goals, what they want to achieve, the expenses, etc.? He said no. He said there's a big obvious gap in there. I do see a potential for this, you know, fulfilling Namibia first, ensuring that gap is filled. I see a potential for NIFA to go outside of Namibia across Africa. Just back
So
to the point you mentioned about the capability building, I think for me personally, mindset is it can through mindset you can either fail or be successful. I'm a big believer when it comes to mindset.
mm,
Through these learnings and targeted engagements, when you look at mindset, how do you focus on that then? What do you deliver to those businesses? You've mentioned that, we show them that businesses need to understand when they need to continue, but businesses need to know that this is not a point where they say we can't go further. How do they pivot maybe? But then that requires mindset as well.
mm. This is a great question which doesn't have a 1+1 = 2. I think understanding the founder is key because it's the personality. For instance, we're quite pragmatic. Life is hard, and I like to emphasize this. Uh, the world owes you nothing. So we actually first start there so that, the person understands that what I also get out of life, is also what I put in. And one thing that one must understand, and I want to really practicalize this, is that, there is obviously this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. So where they feel some, and rightfully so, have been advantaged. Some will ask, I don't have anything. So what are you talking about mindset? This is the example I can give. If I want to ask you, Alaa, for support my bread business, give me $100. What I tell that person is the money you get from your uncle or your friend, because all of us had the opportunity to get like a $10. Once you can show what you can do with a $10, for me, I'm a big believer of if you have 1, 2 customers, you've convinced 2 people to buy into your concept. That's already an action. So mindset is really about saying there's a line, 100 of people have ideas. There's another line, 2 people have done something about it, have executed. That is already the mindset shift. Where I have an idea, I maybe need 1 million. What idea can I show you that this is something that can work? Sometimes it's not even to get to a minimum viable product, right? Sometimes it's how do I translate the idea onto the paper? I can't translate it to the paper, but I can ask my friend that, please, I have this idea. I struggle with, writing. Can you write it for me? 3 pages. Then if I even put in effort to now say, okay, how do I make it look pretty? And then I practice like an interview and come and show you that I have this idea. I'm the only one in this neighborhood. Every weekend, for instance, there's events. They struggle to get ice. If I now can, have a freezer and have ice, I'm going to have 10 customers. So you now pitch that to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people. One's going to buy it. That is mindset. And I think the biggest hindrance, and this is how we also teach them, is to say, we are conditioned to always believe something will not work. That's also a
Mm.
mindset, right? You have to be crazy to be an entrepreneur. I'll be very honest. I mean, I'm qualified. I have a track record, right? I can be in a proper, corporate job, 8 to 5, but this is what gives me the thrill. So I always call myself a corporate hustler. So I understand the traditional system, but I also understand the streets. So if you
Understandable.
talk about mindset, it goes further to say, okay, 5 people told me no, but maybe it's the 10th person that will tell you yes. That's practical, textbook. That is what mindset is about. That also, lastly on that is to say, what problem am I solving? If you realize that these cars break down because there's one knob in the engine that always seems to fall apart. There's a place for startups to come up with new innovative ideas, especially in the African continent. What is our biggest problem? We need jobs. So if that, it's not an innovation, it's now you coming up with some oil that just makes it smoother and then less cars break down. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. It's efficiency. That is a business. Are we together, Alaa? And that's really how we engage, some of the entrepreneurs when we talk about an entrepreneurial mindset. To have back to basics.
Exactly. You've dropped two business ideas just answering that question. I really like what you've said, and you can see it clearly when you said the difference. You understand the corporate, but you also understand the hustle. That made you, I would assume, establish NIFA. You understand there are people on the ground who have ideas, they just lack execution.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we think about ideas, we think about it too much in a way that I need to, okay, this is the idea, but I need to know exactly how I execute it. And I need to be involved in every step of establishing that business. I don't fully agree with that because you may not be able to do it all. You need expertise elsewhere. Like at some point, you need other people to help you and complete it for you. And I like what you guys are doing there in terms of mindset. Let me ask you the last question here is what is the hardest challenge that you're facing right now? Is it moving to different spaces within Namibia, for instance, data and engaging with education institutes, for example, to finding pathways for graduate or talent?
Yeah. They say I've got 99 problems. Firstly, I think with mindset, one must see every problem as a potential opportunity. One of the biggest challenges, it's more open-mindedness, this conditioning that things don't work. So you see, in Africa, when you play safe, right, we'll always be safe. The difference makers, look at all of them. Yeah, most of them are crazy. I think I'm passionate. I don't think I've reached the crazy threshold yet, but there's something you see about difference makers. They are extreme optimists. And I think, and it's not just a Namibia thing, but I think it's Africa, we're very risk averse. I would say that's been one of the challenges that if I experienced, especially in the beginning. So that's access to capital. If I now only focused on that, what I did is, even to date, it's just half my salary, right? And I like what you said. You can't execute everywhere on the value chain. I've invested in my own entity through sweat and my savings. If I can't invest in my own business, how am I going to convince someone to invest in mine? That's the first thing. When I realized there was a challenge, I started investing in myself. And the second thing, you realize that, okay, I can't do everything. And also, you might be smart, but there are other people that are smarter than you. We've got a very deep base of strategic partnerships. Collaborating will move a lot further than working in silo. I quickly realized the growth was going to be limited by trying to do things on your own. Understand the need of the other person and fulfill that need. Share the cake. So that's why you see within our stable, we are partners with the events logistics entity. Why? Because if I have a workshop or a training, I need someone who is good at events and logistics. Should I do it myself? It's going to be too stressful. We collaborate. We've discovered oil, so it's oil and gas, there's green hydrogen, and like you said, skill as an asset class. We now have the ability to map both current and future skills. Would I have been able to achieve that only focusing on NIFA? No, we've collaborated. My background is asset management, advisory. So we've set up one or two parallel entities and have other people there to then complete the value chain. So in the media, there's a joke that says the fat cook is good, which just means the cake is big enough. I think this also comes back to mindset in the sense that if you're open-minded, you're going to see the gaps and welcome collaborations, right? I would really say in a nutshell, I think probably the other challenges is obviously access to capital and scaling, because there's only so far you can get with founder-based investing. But I'm already in the process. I think there are one or two banks that I'm already engaging, and they like what we're doing. You need to leverage. Leverage is what allows you then to scale. But the last thing I'll say is, I think I mentioned it earlier, which is a challenge, but also an opportunity, is how do you show someone that it can work? You have to take the plunge. And that is said, NIFA was founded in 2020, and look at when it really started to kick off. It's more 2024. What I can draw from that is there's never a perfect time to start. It's about
That's right.
doing. I'm also in a full-time job in asset management, and that's why I believe in the concept of bootstrap. Show what you can do with the little capacity that you have. People must see your ability to execute, but be humble enough to say, and I also seek support, because I think everyone buys into someone's vision, they trust, and their ability to execute. And that is quite a key ingredient. And that's what has helped NIFA. It's a startup, effectively, right? But it's a high growth startup that's targeted. So I believe strategic partnerships and leveraging social capital and your network, that's what's important to overcome some of those challenges. So I think, yeah, if that answers it.
And by the sound of the beginning of the discussion, it's clear to me that you do value engagement and collaborations and learning from others. And that's what will eventually take you to where you want to be. And I agree with you, like you need to action and iterate later. So you once you start the plan and you moved with those actions, then if there is any hiccups, then you can iterate and edit as you go
And
along. Some people would like to have the full plan and everything in order before they make the first move. I have enjoyed our conversation very much, and we can go longer for sure. Thanks for going beyond the board with us. I'll leave the links to NIMFA in the video so you understand more about what they do and the programs we discussed here in the show. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Board. I'll see you next time.
cheers.